right, so today we're working on a brand new section. I'm going to call this one Imperial Japan. So go ahead and make a new section title, and we're going to write down Imperial Japan. And then we're going to underline it. So we're going to write down Imperial Japan, and we're going to underline. Now, for this section, you'll see that you got two flags on here. We got a flag on the bottom. We got a flag on the top. Top flag is for Imperial Japan, so that's the rising sun flag. And then the flag on the bottom is for Japan's flag after the World War II. So, before World War II, after World War II. And we kind of have to talk about how that happened. But before we talk about how we got into World War II and the stuff that happens in World War II, we need to talk about what happens before then. Go ahead and make a bullet, and we're going to write down pre-World War I. So we're going to write down pre-World War I. So pre-World War I. Now, before World War I, we need to talk about kind of where the world was. Now, we already talked about where Japan was pre-World War I. We know that Japan, pre-World War I, had defeated the Chinese and defeated the Russians, and they had then gotten into a military alliance with the British. So that's where we're at with Japan. Now, the United States, on the other hand, since we're in the United States, probably should talk about, the United States, on the other hand, got involved in a war in 1898. This was after, of course, the American Civil War, which is from 1861 to 1865. This is said as the Spanish-American War of 1898. Go ahead and make a 1. Write down Spanish-American War of 1898. So while Japan was taking more territory in Korea and defeating the Russians at Port Arthur, the Americans were expanding into the Pacific Ocean as well. This happened during the Spanish-American War of 1898. In the Spanish-American War of 1898, we had a boat hanging out in Cuba, and it somewhat exploded. We blamed the Spanish government for the ship exploding and declared war on Spain. This led us to taking over Cuba. So Cuba's over here. Led us to taking over Cuba from the Spanish and granting the Cubans their independence. It also led us to taking over Puerto Rico, which is over here. And we still own Puerto Rico nowadays. It's a commonwealth of the United States. Not a state, but a commonwealth of the United States. So we took over Cuba, took over Puerto Rico. We went out here. We took over some islands over here. So we took over some Marshall Islands and like Guam. Guam's over there. Some Marshall Islands, Guam. Got over here, took over some other islands. And we even went to the Philippines and took over the Philippines as well from the Spanish. So prior to World War II, the United States owns Puerto Rico, and power extends past Hawaii through these islands here all the way to also the Philippines as well, because we owned the Philippines before World War II. This was so Philippines is their own nation nowadays. They're an independent nation. They were not an independent nation before World War II. World War I and World War II, Philippines is owned by the United States. Okay, so it's not an independent nation. It is a owned area. So then we get into World War I. Now, Japan, since they're buddies with Britain, when Germany in World War I declares war, Japan then gets involved into the war as well. So in World War I, we have two groups. Okay, you have the Central Powers and you have the Allies. All right, those are two groups that we have in World War I. Now, the Central Powers, those are people like Germany, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. All right, so that's the Central Powers. So Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Maybe I should show you guys on a map where these places are. Let's see. Let me look up a World War I. Oops. And that way you guys can kind of see a bit better what I'm talking about, where I'm saying these places. There we go. This one works. Okay. So you can kind of see it a bit better here. It's not the best quality picture, but Germany's right there. So that was the German Empire at this time period. So it was Germany, nowadays Germany, plus north part of Poland. That was the German Empire. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire was down here. It was Austria and the Czech Republic all the way down here through the Serbian nations. Okay, so kind of the Serbian nations, not Serbia itself, but the other places that were Serbian. And also in the Central Powers were the Ottoman Empire, which is modern day Turkey. So basically, modern day Turkey, kind of going for this area all the way for Jerusalem. That was the Ottoman Empire. So it's those three nations, Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, versus the Allies. And the main allies, so the main ally nations, okay, the ones that did the most amount of work, all right, the main ally nations were Britain, France, Russia, the United States, so the United States, and Japan was also a main ally as well. Although Japan does most of their work in Asia area and taking away colonies away from the Germans. That's the most of what they do. Okay, let's make a bullet and write down World War One. So I'll make a bullet and write down World War One. And then we're going to write down the groups that we had. So we're going to make a 1. We're going to write down Central Powers equal sign. And then we're going to write down those three nations. So 1, Central Powers equal sign, Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So those are the three empires that are the main Central Powers in World War I. So Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. How World War I starts is with the death of an archduke, an Austrian archduke. He ends up getting assassinated. That causes the Austrian-Hungarian Empire to declare war on Serbia, and Serbia was buddies with Russia. That caused the Russians then declare war on the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which then caused Germany and the Ottoman Empire to then declare war on Russia. And Russia was buddies with Britain and France, so then Britain and France got involved, and Japan got involved. And then eventually we get involved later on because of the sinking of one of our ships that pulls us into war later on. 2, allies. So 2, we're going to write down 2, allies, equal sign. Britain, France, USA, Russia, and Japan. So 2, allies, equal sign. Britain, France, USA, Russia, and Japan. So World War I drags on for a while, and World War I is a very defensive war. And what I mean by defensive war is people would dig trenches, and in those trenches, they would just have a whole bunch of them going all around the place. So let me show you what a trench looks like. So World War I, and let me show you a trench so you kind of know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about that. Oops. There we go. So what's a trench? These are trenches. Okay, you kind of see how it's a hole, not really a hole, but like a pathway that's dug. Okay, so it's kind of see how it's a pathway that's dug. So it's kind of a pathway that dug, and you would hide behind the barrier, and then you would pop up. You shoot over the barrier and such. So you kind of see this guy shooting over the barrier and such. So he's got like a little hole there for him to shoot through. And so that's basically how it kind of worked. Is you would be in the trenches, you would then fire, over the trench and so forth. You see these guys firing over the trench there. And it was a very defensive war in which you're just in these trenches. And it was very defensive because of machine guns like this. So you see how this is a machine gun. They were very defensive because of machine guns like this. So if you ever try to cross from one trench area to another trench area, well, you would have someone shooting machine gun at you the entire time, which made crossing over from one trench to another trench really difficult. So you would have a trench, of Germans, and then the trench of Germans would be like a mile, or could even be a quarter of a mile really from the trench of the Allies. So you just have all these trenches just dug all over the place, and they really weren't too far from each other. And the entire war was just very small steps that each side would make. So each side would just kind of make very small steps. Why they were in mask here? So during World War I, we used a lot of chemical weapons So there was a lot of mustard gas was used a lot, and other chemicals that would cause your lungs to fail, and then you would basically suffocate to death, and then you would die. So you had to have a mask to kind of, so that you could breathe and so forth. And you also wanted to kind of cover any exposed skin, because exposed skin exposed to the chemicals could get damaged and such. So yeah, World War One, not really a pleasant war. I guess no wars are pleasant, but you know. So that's kind of how World War One goes. Okay, so it's a very slow war. So machine guns made wars very defensive. When tanks come out at the end of the war, they make wars very offensive, because a tank obviously doesn't care about machine gun. The bullets just kind of reflect right off it because it's got a whole bunch of armor. All right, we're gonna stop there.